The Red Dead Redemption series has come to define more than just the death of a way of life. It represents the ushering in of a new world, and with it, the end of an entire era. And in the specific case of Red Dead Redemption 2, it goes a little further. It captures the collapse of an entire group of people doing everything they can to resist the new, encroaching ways of a so-called civilized world. Through this lens, both Arthur and John, within the respective stories, create narratives centered on redemption, on the idea of trying to redeem themselves, of absolving, or at the very least, doing everything they can to make up for the transgressions of their outlaw lives, by renouncing the constant killing, the robbing, and by doing their best to save those closest to them, even if they can't save themselves. These are stories that feel deeply human, because the people themselves are incredibly flawed, and they help build the foundation of stories that demystify the transitional period between the dying days of the Wild West and the rise of a more modernized world. In doing so, this then leads to opening the door to a more compelling discussion about what redemption really means. How does one truly become redeemed? Can they? Or do certain circumstances, like being confronted with a terminal illness unexpectedly, completely complicate that idea? Does it make redemption feel less noble and more like an admission, an acknowledgement you're forced to finally face that you lived your entire life the wrong way, and that it was only something outside of your control that finally forced you to confront that? Not a choice made freely, but simply because time ran out. Today we're going to be looking at an outlaw who gained such notoriety in his lifetime that he isn't just casually referenced by name in Red Dead Redemption 2.
New pair of pants, think you're Landon Ricketts.
He's spoken about as if everyone in this world already knows exactly who he is. A man who was officially reported dead after a shootout in California in 1902, only to reappear some 9 years later in an entirely different country. Landon Ricketts. A man who, according to John, was already famous and well known back when he was still a young boy. Now, to be clear, this isn't a video about Landon Ricketts' early life, his rise, or the full details of his past. Instead, we're taking a different angle. Two of them primarily. The first is how Landon recenters John's philosophy, while John is down here in Mexico chasing former friends, working both sides of a local revolution and justifying it all as a means to an end. And the second is how Landon Ricketts was, in a very unique way, already living the life Dutch always claimed he wanted. A quiet escape, a peaceful retreat into another country, and a life of relative obscurity, with some deviations of Dutch's vision and, of course, Ricketts' reality. Ricketts didn't come down here to Mexico to disappear out of spite, or sit around brooding over a world moving on without him. He was here. He remembered who he was, why he fought, and chose when to relive the person he always was.
What a great way to improve border relations. An illiterate farmer crossing the river, coming into their civilization and butchering the local peasants. You kill peasants, you become a peasant.
John unexpectedly runs into Landon Ricketts in 1911, 9 years after Ricketts was believed to have been killed, and 4 years after the epilogue of Red Dead Redemption 2. At this point, John is fully wrapped up in his mission for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, tasked with tracking down Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela in exchange for the safe return of his wife and son, and their release as a family back home to Beecher's Hope. The former has retreated south into this foreign land, and that's exactly why John is here. Landon Ricketts, meanwhile, has long since left the outlaw life behind him in the United States. By the time John meets him, Landon is living quietly in the town of Chuparosa, where he's taking on a role that's closer to a vigilante or a volunteer lawman than anything official. He doesn't work for the government, and he isn't acting under any formal authority, but the people in town know who he is and what he's capable of, and they go to him when trouble finds them. The local bank teller comes to Landon after bandits attack his wagon just outside of town. Emilio seeks him for the help of rescuing his sister Luisa, and later Luisa herself approaches Landon when a local writer and politician is facing execution at the hands of Colonel Allende's men. For those that haven't played the original Red Dead Redemption, Allende is the Mexican army official that rules the area as its governor, and he is seen to abuse his power by both indiscriminately attacking villages and taking women from those raised villages for his own personal pleasure. And consequently, Landon himself ends up in a very unique position. While we never get a clear timeline of when he arrived in Mexico or how long he's been down here, it's obvious that he's become something of an outlier. He understands the political climate of the country, especially in this region, which is already deeply caught up in a revolutionary movement, and unlike many Americans who have come down here to help the rebels or stir things up, or insert themselves in the conflict for personal wealth or fame, Landon doesn't do that. Instead, he stays in a small town that sits just outside the army's reach. It isn't heavily touched by the rebels either, but it's close enough that people talk and news travels. Close enough that Landon knows what's happening without needing to actively involve himself in every part of it. He's dialed in, even while keeping his distance and staying to himself. And from the moment he crosses paths with John, he recognizes exactly what he's dealing with. He sees John as an angry, semi-literate farmer who's already managed to give Americans in Mexico an even worse reputation by doing precisely what he just did, going into a village and butchering a handful of peasants.
Hold it, Gringo, I think you're forgetting something. A little taxation. I have a large family.
Very big.
I too have a family friend. So that we may see our families again, I suggest we part ways amicably.
Can I see the boots, Gringo?
I think you can see him from where you're standing just fine, senor.
Take off the boots, Americano.
As you wish.
Oh, very good. Very good indeed, sir. What a great way to improve border relations. An illiterate farmer crossing the river, coming into their civilization and butchering the local peasants?
There's an argument to be made that they were attempting to intimidate John, jokingly asking for a little taxation on account of not remembering inviting John to their country, going on to share that they do speak a little bit of English, repeating discriminatory and racial comments hurled at them, presumably by Americans, to then taking John's hat and asking to see his boots. Maybe there was another way. Maybe a little diplomacy would have worked. John, at the very least, did provide some fair warning, so you gotta give him credit there. Given the circumstances, even though Ricketts goes on to chastise John for the alleged ruthless action he just took of butchering the local peasants, and thus negatively affecting the border relations between these two peoples, upon further replays, I personally believe Ricketts' words here don't really reflect his feelings on the border itself. I mean, both he and John go on to display a similar level of sarcasm to each other. A small reflection showing not only why Ricketts would later remark John reminds him of a younger, angrier version of himself, as they similarly go on to sidestep answering the question of who they are, to later do the same thing in what they're doing here. But I think it better reflects Ricketts' own sense of himself and seeing the potential within John. As he says, butchering peasants would leave you to be nothing more than a peasant yourself. Which also connects to his comments of worrying for John, of how he has no problem in killing quail or peasants, but if he has to face another man, that's where John is going to be running into real problems, due to his angry disposition and the way he sloppily handles a gun. It could also be a clever mix of betraying his view of who and why someone is worthy of being killed by him, and maybe even a small test for John. Really, the whole initial interaction between them breaks down to a famed gunslinger overwatching the innocent and kind people of this town, facing someone who's angry and sloppily handles a gun far away from home, yet admits he isn't a man of political principles, making him his own outlier as many Americans head down south into Mexico to further agitate the political climate within the region. So much so, in fact, that when John goes to the Mexican army and even the rebels, both sides are weary of John's real intentions, with some of them even commenting that Americans forget why they initially fight. It's easy for them to get behind a cause, come down here, find personal wealth or fame, and make the situation worse off than it was. Despite their somewhat rocky start, he ultimately decides to take him under his wing and teach him a few things. And that choice is interesting when you start looking at it through the lens of Deadeye as an in-universe skill set, something only the most experienced and disciplined gunmen develop over years of honing their accuracy, speed, and focus. Having Ricketts teach John that next step does a couple things at once. On a technical level, it sort of retroactively reframes John's abilities in the epilogue of Red Dead Redemption 2, where he's already capable of using it. The easiest way to square that is To chalk it up to John being angry and out of practice and rusty after years away from the gunslinging life rather than treating it as a contradiction. Especially when you factor in that Red Dead Redemption 2 of course came out after the original game. More importantly though, it reinforces just how dangerous Landon Ricketts still is at such an old age. This is a man far removed from formal duels and large-scale shootouts, at least the kind that carried real stakes back in the United States. And yet here in Mexico, even the Mexican army is underprepared for him. Despite the years, despite the distance from that life, Ricketts is still operating at a level John hasn't reached yet. This serves as a foundational block for the legendary figure that is Landon Ricketts, and more importantly, the bridge between him and John. John gets to learn a few of Ricketts' old tricks, while Ricketts both gets a little of companionship from a fellow American, while understanding the unique position John is in, serving as a unique case of why an American would come down here in Mexico. It's within his unique circumstances though, Ricketts would also come to contrast John deeply. Save for the mission Lucky in Love, 1 out of 4 missions Ricketts is involved in, Ricketts hints to John why he's not making as much headway in locating the 2 men he seeks. People talk, and even Ricketts hears of John's exploits, again without having to be all that involved, and he warns him as early as their second encounter. But John only meets these warnings with anger.
I've been hearing some things about you, John Marston.
Really?
That perhaps you're more in need of my help than I thought.
Is that so?
That some recent encounters with this Bill Williamson fella haven't gone exactly in your favor.
Funny how everyone seems to know my business, but nothing about the men I'm looking for.
It isn't easy getting the locals to talk.
In their last encounter together, Ricketts would return to the idea of not easily getting the locals to talk, while sharing what is probably the best quote Ricketts has in the entire game.
Perhaps you would know. Rumor has it you've been making all kinds of new friends.
I don't pay much attention to rumors.
Just be careful, John. Keep jumping from one side of the fence to the other, you might just get impaled. All I'm saying is, maybe there's a reason why people around here don't want to talk.
It's also worth noting that by this point, depending on player choice, John has gone so far as to entertain the company of Captain DeSanta, defend an army trained from the rebels, burn down rebel hideouts, and aid in the capture of women for Allende and his men. On the flip side, he does help in rescuing Luisa, defending Chuparosa from bandits, and helping people eventually escape execution into the United States, and even openly entertaining the idea in the presence of the army of going to the rebels and helping Allende continues to yield little results in his personal task. And so for Ricketts, by brute forcing John's own goal, he's essentially telling him that he's limiting his own resource pool. He could attempt to justify his worst actions, but that's still simply what it is, a justification. And he does it in a very aggressive tone. He compares John to a rat feeding from every hand he can find. Unlike John, Ricketts' name actually means something, and unlike John, who's distastefully going after former friends, Ricketts makes it clear that if it were him, he would have turned around and made the people forcing that choice understand exactly what kind of mistake they made. He wouldn't be chasing old allies to earn his family back, he'd be confronting the ones who took them in the first place. Granted, Ricketts most likely isn't aware that John is being pushed around by a government-contracted agency, but that almost doesn't matter. What their time together really shows is Landon Ricketts' mentality, the contrast between killing and bounty hunting the people you once rode with, versus having your family held hostage in exchange for those same people. John's justification for involvement versus Ricketts' choice to get involved is an underlying element within their interactions in Red Dead Redemption that personally I wish had a little more time. And maybe if there was another 3 to 4 missions that involved Ricketts, perhaps we would have gotten that extra depth. Considering Ricketts still puts his skills and his time to use, but doing it in a way that feels deliberate, controlled, and in a way that benefits the people around him rather than dragging them further into chaos. It does also feel a little bit like he represents a version of the life Dutch always talked about, the life that Dutch always wanted to uphold. Not constantly on the run or angrily defying the progression of the world, but choosing on his own terms when to vanish into a quiet, more peaceful life. A way that Dutch possibly could have done, but never did.
Landon Ricketts. Not a name that means much anymore. Yeah, killing men's a strange kind of fame. I was the fastest in my time, I must have been. I'm the only one left.
While it's not a one-to-one comparison, it does make sense to acknowledge Landon Ricketts as something of a philosophical counterpart to Dutch. And it's tempting to say that Ricketts never needed one last score to disappear somewhere beyond the reach of the law. It's also tempting to say that he didn't have an entire group of people depending on him for guidance or survival, all while trying to maintain the rational, caring facade Dutch works so hard to hold together. But the reality is, because we know so little about large portions of Ricketts' life, there isn't much room to make definitive claims about any of that. What we can speak to is how he treats John, and how he goes about course correcting him. Instead of asking John to rally behind some abstract idea or warning him about a looming threat just around the corner the way Dutch so often did, Ricketts challenges him directly. And it's not done with any form of speeches or grand visions, but in a way that forces John to look inward, to reckon with the impact of his own actions, the positions he's taken, and the ways he's been dishonest with himself. And unlike Dutch's influence, which always spills outward and pulls others into its wake, Ricketts' influence turns John back on himself. The consequences don't fall on a gang or a cause, they fall squarely on John and John alone. And the fact that Ricketts has people in Chuparosa who depend on him only strengthen the idea that a life like this is viable for Dutch, or at least was. If we're willing to believe that Dutch needed the sense of dependency that he craved being relied upon, then Ricketts' situation proves there was a way to have it without clinging to a gang or constantly running from the law. Not just dependency either, but a degree of recognition, a simple nod of quiet respect, and maybe even a form of a little notoriety. All without the chaos Dutch insisted was unavoidable. If you strip the Pinkertons out of the equation for a moment and look back at the stretch between 1899 and 1907, the years of the main story of Red Dead Redemption 2 and its epilogue respectively, Dutch effectively disappears for nearly 8 years. Outside of a single newspaper rumor placing him somewhere in the Tall Trees region, there's no confirmation of where he went or what he was doing. In that context, an exit similar to Ricketts doesn't just seem possible, it feels entirely achievable. And thus, with all of these elements, it compounds and starts poking even more holes in the idea that Dutch was fighting purely out of necessity, or that he stayed because there was no other option. The alternative did exist. And if anything, that makes his choice to remain, to stay close to the very region tied to the massacre that began the collapse of his original gang, feel less like survival and more like fixation. Maybe it was about the attention, the notoriety, or the simple desire to just keep fighting. And maybe by the end, the abstract language of freedom mattered less than the excitement of gun smoke and bloodshed itself. That isn't something Ricketts needed, and it's something Dutch never let go of. It was a sad and brutal ending for John's former mentor and adopted father. And for the other, it stands as proof that when you're smart about it, consistent in your own logic, and honest with yourself, you can choose your own exit strategy. You can decide how you continue to live, and you can recognize when it's time to stop waiting, stop fighting, and return on your own terms. And just like Ricketts did, you can fade out quietly, not in a blaze of gunfire or ominous warnings to those that come after you, but by simply going to sleep one night and never waking up, just as Landon Ricketts did.